This is another iRaw podcast.
Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting listening to this season how diverse the range of topics are in relation to politics. Like politics is this like huge kind of umbrella that encompasses so many different types of relationships or so I thought it was really helpful to start off with interviewing Will Kimlicka in the very first episode, and specifically when he made that distinction about the three different ways of doing politics, or three different models, I suppose, where you have the politics on behalf of animals, where it's about representative politics. You got politics by animals, so the animals in their own communities, whether it's interspecies or within their own species, doing their own kinds of politics, organizing and governing themselves. And then you have the interspecies or multispecies one, which is politics with animals. And so just having that kind of framework and then listening to the rest of the episodes, I just thought, yeah, I mean, sometimes we're talking about doing politics with other animals, but a lot of times it's actually politics within the animal advocacy movement, where there are all these kind of internal debates between abolition and reform and strategies and tactics. So I just thought, yeah, that was fascinating. Those are all really fascinating discussions and really demonstrates, like just, how many different things are a part of these kind of political discussions about animal advocacy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Animal Turn podcast. This is season 6, episode 10. We've reached the end of the season, if you can believe it. It's been an incredible journey. I've definitely learned a lot about animals and politics. And in this conversation today with Virginia and Darren, I really was able to kind of grapple with some of those lessons. And something that really stood out for me was when in the conversation, Darren kind of mentioned how much talking about the politics with regards to animals involves talking about the politics with regards to humans. The conversation today with Darren and Virginia is really interesting, pulls apart a variety of different synergies and conflicts that have come up over the course of the season. And it offers a really good, I think, overview of the season and the things that we have covered. Now, in approaching this episode today, Virginia suggested that we call it an early career researcher review. And she's not wrong. I've recently finished my PhD, so has Virginia. She's a postdoc, and Darren is about to complete his PhD. So maybe that would be a more accurate title than a grad review. But I'm going to stick with grad review, and I'm going to use grad in the loosest, broadest way of maybe meaning early career researcher, simply because that's what they've been called in the past, and it rolls off the tongue a little easier than early career researcher review. But maybe that'll change in future. Let's see how things progress and develop. But let me tell you a little bit about the two people who are with me today. You definitely already know Virginia. She has been hosting and telling you all about the animal highlights throughout the course of the season so far. And she's been doing a really incredible job with it. So Virginia Thomas is an environmental social scientist with a PhD in sociology. She's interested in people's interactions with their environment and with other animals. Virginia's work explores the social and ethical questions in human-animal relations. At the time of the interview, she was a research fellow with the Wellcome Trust-funded project called From Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals, which examines the drivers and consequences of animal feeding. This leads on from her previous research, which examined human-animal relations in the media as part of zoonotic disease framing and in rewilding projects in relation to biopolitics and human-animal coexistence. Virginia recently started a new position with Ag Research, where she is an evaluation specialist. So she's a really awesome person. I've had a lot of fun working together with her over the course of the season and learning from her. And I think the animal highlights are testament to just how complexly and interestingly she thinks about animals and human-animal relations. Now, the other guest in today's episode is Darren Chang, and I have the pleasure of knowing Darren from Queen's University. He was with me together or as part of the Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics research group. Let me tell you a bit about Darren. Darren is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and a member of the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. His research interests broadly include interspecies relations under colonialism and global capitalism, practices of solidarity, kinship, and mutual aid across species in challenging oppressive powers, social movement theories, and multi-species justice. And he's written quite a bit about this. Through political and politicized ethnography at animal sanctuaries, Darren's PhD research project explores potential alignments and tensions between animal and other social and environmental justice movements. The multi-species dimensions of this project also consider the place, positions, and subjectivities of non-human animals in relation to anthropogenic social movements. So Darren and Virginia come from very different, I think, backgrounds, scholarly backgrounds, but it was really fascinating to see how those scholarly backgrounds, coupled with mine, blended together in a really interesting conversation about animals and politics. So I hope you've enjoyed the season. I hope you enjoy this overview and review of the season. And I look forward to reading your ratings and reviews. Those go a really long way in terms of helping people to find us and, learn more about animals and animal scholarship. So if you have a spot of time, please, please, please leave us a review or a rating. It goes a long way. But that's it for now. Enjoy listening. Welcome to the final episode of the season. I'm very excited. It's been a fascinating season, and I'm delighted to be joined by Virginia and Darren with me on the show today to do a bit of a review of the season that's gone. So welcome to the show, Virginia and Darren.
Happy to be here.
Hi. So let's get straight to it. Can you guys tell me a little bit about yourselves? Let's start with you, Darren. What kind of work do you do, and how did you get interested in animal studies?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question. So when I was doing my undergrad, I majored in political theory. And in my fourth year, I had this awesome opportunity to take a course called Political Theory and Non-Human Life, taught by Professor Laura Genera at the University of British Columbia. And so that was the first time that I was exposed to the ideas that human relations with non-humans is actually very much a political matter. And it's an issue pertaining to justice, to power. And so when I was growing up, I was exposed to vegetarianism because my parents both became vegetarians for spiritual reasons. And so I kind of was aware of issues around animal suffering throughout my adolescence. But that was kind of the first time that I realized that animal suffering is actually very much a political and social justice issue as well. And so I just ended up pursuing that further throughout my master's and now doing a PhD with a focus on multi-species justice.
That's fascinating. Where are you doing your PhD?
Oh, I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Sydney.
You're working with Dinesh, right?
Yeah, Dinesh Wadwell and Danielle Salameyer are my supervisors. And so I am in the Department of Sociology and Criminology, but I'm also a member of the Sydney Environment Institute, which is an interdisciplinary institute here at Sydney Uni with a lot of different projects happening simultaneously. But the one that I'm a part of is called Multispecies Justice.
Wow, you're a lucky fish to be working there with those people, because I think they are really some of the leaders in critical animal studies thought. We know each other, which is we haven't spent a great deal of time with one another, but we've definitely crossed paths in Canada because we both know Will Kimlick and Sue Donaldson and the A.P.P.L.E group in Kingston. And I've got this vivid memory of bumping into you in Toronto when you were protesting and I was going to lunch. So I think it shows some of our different ways of doing things. But could you tell us a little bit about your activism work?
Yeah, I suppose the way it happened was all kind of coincidental. So I got into animal rights activism around the same time that I was taking that course I had mentioned on political theory and non-human life. And at the time, there was a very active campaign targeting University of British Columbia around animal experimentation. So I got in touch with some of the local activists who then, I got involved in that, and they I learned about veganism through grassroots activism. Yeah. And so I'd say over the past decade or so, it's I've had one foot in each realm, I suppose, in academia and grassroots activism, and just really trying to make connections between the two. I would say over time, the activism in terms of organizing, getting involved in different types of campaigns has really shaped a lot of my academic, more like theoretical work and analysis.
That's really great. I hope we get to talk more about that in the episode, because I think there is this interesting kind of tension, at least in terms of imaginaries with regards to activism and politics. So I'm hoping we'll get more into that. Virginia guests kind of know a little bit already, I would hope, if you've listened to some of the episodes. Virginia's been doing our animal highlights this season, and now we actually get to learn a little bit more about you. So Virginia, can you tell us how you became involved in animal studies?
Yeah, it was like Darren. I did a PhD in sociology at the University of Exeter in England, and it was focusing on rewilding. But what came up more and more was the animals involved in rewilding and the really interesting bits for animal agency in rewilding as you shift from the domestic to the wild in rewilding. You get this really interesting state of human-animal relationships that we don't really have a good idea of how to manage yet. I think we're quite good at thinking about domestic relationships with animals, or our relationships with domestic animals, I should say. And we're quite good at thinking about our relationships with wild animals. But then you get these liminal animals in rewilding that we're still working out how to be with. So that came up more and more in my research. So I got really interested in that. And then I was really fortunate when I finished my PhD, I was able to stay on at the University of Exeter and do a postdoc on a Wellcome Trust funded project called From Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals, which was just entirely about exploring our relationship with animals through food and feeding. And it was a really big project, loads of different people coming at it from loads of different angles, but I still stuck on the conservation element and looked at feeding animals in reintroduction projects. And it's just so interesting because you go on that journey from, if not the domestic, at least the captive to the wild. And food is just so interesting in all that relationship.
Yeah, food is definitely, I think, central. Food and the practice of eating. I remember having a conversation with Catherine Oliver when we did the urban season, focused on urban metabolism. And we just realized that when you start to look at eating, and we tend to, I think, often talk about human eating practices, right? Whether we're vegetarian or vegan or etc. But I think when you start to just focus on relations around eating, things get really interesting really quickly, because eating is central to all of our lives, right? It's like it literally nourishes us and causes conflict and does all sorts of things. So I think that what a fascinating project. So are you looking at conservation from like a sociological perspective, or are you also incorporating like environmental science into your thinking here?
No, I call it environmental social science. So I'm purely coming at it from a sociological perspective. So I'm looking at the people involved and the human-animal relationships, especially when you get animals reintroduced, because you get these new human-animal relationships and renewed coexistence where animals and humans haven't coexisted previously.
Yeah, and of course, this speaks to some of the themes that I think have come up this season, where we're thinking about like collective decision making, and or collective, I don't know, living. Maybe we can switch now to thinking a little bit about the season and some of your general, thoughts and ideas. Because just hearing you speak now, I think for me, decision making, which maybe is perhaps not surprising, seemed to be like a central theme that came up time and again, just maybe not said in those words. What do you guys think about that? Or feel free to share any of your own kind of themes or ideas.
Well, I could say something about decision making. I think the interesting thing about decision making when it comes to human-animal relations that came up in this is what level you think at, whether you're thinking about individuals or species or types like wild or domestic. And that just changes everything. And it entirely depends what you're trying to achieve. But there are so many trade-offs, because what might be the right decision for a species is not necessarily the right decision for an individual, and vice versa. And that definitely came up with a lot of the guests on this. Probably what Andrea Schapper was saying particularly, that that comes to mind because that's such a recent episode.
Yeah, I mean, I also wrote down scale because I think it's interesting that you mentioned there the difference between, because there's the species, like there's almost a taxonomy, but there's also a scale at which decision-making happens, right? So like you've got decision-making happening in the home. I think pets came up time and again. You've got decision-making happening at the nation state level. What is a nation's policies? And then of course, like the global level came up both with Andrea and with Angie, right? Speaking about cosmopolitanism, like at what level are animals included or excluded in decision-making? And I think what we found was throughout, oftentimes, unless you're thinking about animals' decision-making processes, which I think Will alluded to, most of the time, the ways in which our societies are structured, whether it's in the home or at a global scale, animals are largely absent. Darren, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting listening to this season how diverse the range of topics are in relation to politics. Like politics is this like huge kind of umbrella that encompasses so many different types of relationships or so. I thought it was really helpful to start off with interviewing Will Kimlicka in the very first episode, and specifically when he made that distinction about the three different ways of doing politics, or three different models, I suppose, where you have the politics on behalf of animals, where it's about representative politics. You got politics by animals, so the animals in their own communities, whether it's interspecies or within their own species, doing their own kinds of politics, organizing and governing themselves. And then you have the interspecies or multispecies one, which is politics with animals. And so just having that kind of framework and then listening to the rest of the episodes, I just thought, yeah, I mean, sometimes we're talking about doing politics with other animals, but a lot of times it's actually politics within the animal advocacy movement, where there are all these kind of internal debates between abolition and reform and strategies and tactics. So I just thought, yeah, that was fascinating. Those are all really fascinating discussions and really demonstrates, yeah, like just, how many different things are a part of these kind of political discussions about animal advocacy.
Yeah, politics is just huge. And I think, yeah, I mean, obviously you can't cover everything in 9 interviews, but, that taxonomy that Will gave was really helpful. But it's clear to me that, for example, something that's missing in this season was kind of a real consideration of the ways animals do politics, or at least the ways some specific animals do politics, right? I could have imagined an episode focused on elephant politics and collective decision making, or fish politics and their decision making, but that's kind of missing, I think, in this season. It was very much focused on like doing politics on behalf of animals and maybe to some extent with animals, but I think the season was very much located in that behalf of animals, or at least thinking about how we could do. It was quite a bit of it was like future oriented, I think. Or ideal theory. This is now a word I know, ideal theory.
I was going to say something I not thought was missing, but was surprised didn't come up, was biopolitics. And there's definitely work that talks about how animals can contribute to biopolitics and different forms of biopolitics through their agency of, their sort of unruly nature in the wild that changes the way we think about governing them.
Yeah. I mean, biopolitics is obviously like just such a massive and complicated concept, and it has come up previously. So I did speak to Krithika Srinivasan about biopolitics previously. And yeah, but I think it is interesting. In some ways, we were focused on kind of traditional, quote unquote, ideas like the nation state, the UN, whereas we weren't maybe talking about this more diffuse. But it came up, like Darren says, I think this diffuse politics did come up, but maybe not in the way, like a Foucauldian biopolitical framework would emerge. So yeah, that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, I think it was only briefly touched on in the episode with Dinesh Wadwell on violence, where he discussed the concept of sovereignty and how oftentimes, the objective of a sovereign state is to maintain and exert domination over those who have been conquered through warfare. And so I think there's, kind of references to biopolitics in that sense. But I guess the conversation really focused a lot more on epistemic violence in that interview, from what I remember.
I really love the concept of epistemic violence and also epistemic erasure, the way that Dinesh brought that forward, because I think this was really central, is who's made visible and invisible and in which spaces, right? But something I thought, like, I think imagination, and I know this comes up in every grad review, I'm like, imagination is here, but I think imagination really was playing a critical role here, as it felt like there was a tension and an exciting tension between thinking about how politics is currently done and what politics might be in future. So this kind of epistemic erasure, I think everybody pointed to an anthropocentric bias. Everybody pointed to the fact that animals are not included, they're not visible, and if they are visible, they're visible as kind of property or commodities, right? But the ways in which people were thinking about this could manifest in future, the kind of the imaginary, and I think that epistemic erasure compels us to think, well, how do we actually include them? You know, do we only think of victims? Do we only think of animals as victims or objects of violence? And as Dinesh would say, we don't even do that. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think it's really interesting. What did you guys find interesting? If you were to pick, like, what really stood out for you in this season?
Yeah, I definitely felt the same way during that conversation with Steve Cook about imagination, because I do think that overall, even within the animal advocacy movement, there seems to be a bit of a crisis of imagination happening where it's really difficult for animal advocates to imagine alternative approaches to ultimately achieving whether it's multi-species justice or just a generally more compassionate world. The kind of tactics that are commonly used is to just keep trying to promote veganism on kind of an individual consumer level, which is definitely very important. But at the same time, there is a difficulty in both engaging with the broader institutional and structural forms of violence against animals, but also kind of recognizing the limitations of certain tactics. And yeah, so I felt like that relates to this urgent need for us to reimagine not just the future kind of societies that we want to create and to arrive at, but definitely the more creative ways that we can be expanding on our own activism.
Well, for me, that started to come up in this season. For me, the sort of conventional animal rights that we talk about with advocacy were being extended by all this. You know, you don't often hear about property rights and citizenship rights, and the sort of rights for animals that we would usually extend only to humans were really getting put forward in this. And then the idea that there should be some kind of universal recognition at a really broad level of animal rights beyond just the sort of the things that we normally see being campaigned for in activism. I thought that was really interesting.
There was kind of like positive rights, right? I think that's how many people would say, instead of just talking about the negative rights, don't hurt them, you know, don't use them as property. There is an act of like, it's improv, it's adding, right? There's an act of like, and let's do this, and let's do this. It's not just about not hurting them. There are positive duties, I suppose.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I thought the concept of reanimalization really brought that home when you suddenly go, okay, it's not just about extending rights to animals, but it might actually be about curtailing some of ours, some human rights. You know, why should humans be more than animal? Was that the way around? I got was that the way around it was used?
Yeah, I believe that's right.
And I think we both had a moment of like, are we more than that? Like, we were like, because I was actually in a conversation with some people yesterday, because we're getting really saucy with all of our prefixes with human and animal, right? We're like more than human, post-human. Like, I mean, there's every prefix we're playing around with it, which is good. I think it does show this kind of disruption of the stable idea of human and animal. But yeah, I think reanimalization was really, she got to, I think she also, I don't know if she actually used the words kind of burdens and benefits, but she got to like the risks and opportunities and the ways in which they're distributed. And I think this was something Angie was also bringing up time and again, right, with Cosmo. They were maybe speaking at different scales. And I think it's not just animal and human, it's even within kind of this massive category of animals, specific animals are really bearing the brunt and the burdens of our decisions to live in particular ways, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I find the concept of reanimalization and also as a practice to think about what that actually looks like absolutely fascinating. And yeah, it definitely kind of got me thinking about, all this work that we've been doing in terms of promoting and raising awareness about the complexities and diversity of other animals' cognitions or, capacities, various forms of capacities, sentience, and whether they have, sociality and cultures and all these things, just really trying to get the human species, broadly speaking, to really try to empathize with other animals and gain this kind of understanding. And obviously that work is absolutely crucial and should definitely be supported and expanded on. But I feel like there's a missing dimension to that conversation, which is what about the humans? Because if we think about some sort of political compromise that might be necessary in order for us to achieve something like multi-species justice, it isn't, I guess, enough to simply just gain more and more knowledge about species, but we need to critically reflect on our own political status and identity as human beings and what that means, because there certainly seems to be a kind of limitation that we've arrived at in terms of the traditional advocacy approaches, which is all the things I had mentioned, this kind of bring attention to the complexities of other species' lives. But it's definitely, where we got to meet the other animals halfway, I suppose, is kind of the way I'm thinking about it, is like, what does it actually mean for us to be actively animalizing or reanimalizing ourselves? What does that look like?
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Sorry, meeting them halfway. I think that's fantastic. We're not good at that.
Yeah. I think we need to go more than halfway. But maybe, because I think we've already gone more than halfway. I think if we look, this is where metaphors fail us, but, the benefits and burdens have been so skewed in our favor in so many ways that I think halfway doesn't quite do it. But I really love that idea of political compromise, because and you think about any sort of political change and movement, right? The end of apartheid in South Africa, the end of slavery, the end of think of any sort of big political change or movement. A big part of that conversation becomes compromise. You're going to have to learn to give up some of your power. There needs to be room for concessions. And maybe these are not fair comparisons, but I think they are really acute examples of how, when you need to repair what have been really unequal political relations, there's a requirement for those who have dominated to concede, to give up some of what makes their lives comfortable and nice. And that's often what makes it a really conflicting and difficult process.
Yeah, it's so challenging because on the one hand, I feel like just simply focusing on other species' capacities, it's getting to a point where it doesn't seem to really undermine or threaten human supremacy and anthropocentrism. We can always fall back on some sort of difference between humans and other species to kind of reassure of our superiority. And the other side of this challenge is that historically, so many marginalized and oppressed peoples have been oppressed precisely through the process of dehumanization or animalization, sometimes simultaneously. And so there's almost an inherent risk even just to even talk about and have conversations about reanimalization, which I think came up a little bit in the interview with Kritika. Yeah. So it's really difficult.
And I think what came up in the interview with, I think, Angie Pepper on cosmopolitanism was that when you're asking people to concede some of the sort of benefits that they've had from enslaving animals, that might work for developed nations, but for people who are sort of in subsistence situations, there definitely needs to be a sort of a transition period, because you can further marginalize people who are already marginalized and dependent on animals for subsistence. And if you suddenly go, no, we need to change the system completely, then you just further disadvantage them. So it's not simple, which of course we know it's not, but
yeah, this brings us back, I think, to something Darren raised a bit earlier. You know, a lot of this kind of, we're speaking about, this is a season focused on animals and politics, but oftentimes in trying to even talk about animals and politics, we need to think about human to human politics, because it comes up time and again, right? The histories of how animalization has been used to oppress very specific human groups and a wider range of human groups, right? Across indigenous groups to women to people of color. And then on top of that, and I think this is something Kritika brought up as well, is how development is also used, I think, as this kind of tool to say what is and is not possible, right? Like development is put forward as this kind of linear pathway of supposedly developing countries are, you know, in some sort of backward state and they're just trying to get to where developed countries are. But maybe what reanimalization does, and this is the tension between these two, is that I think it forces us to say, well, wait, hang on. What are those other relations? Because maybe subsistence farming or these other versions of using animals are closer to, and I know that this is all like politically fraught, even saying this type of sentence is full of challenges, but maybe that's more politically closer to what because there are more risks involved, right? You look at people farming in India, there are far more risks involved in farming when you've got elephants that are literally tarnishing your crops. You've got tigers where there is massive conflict with tigers. There are literally more risks. And this is what made that conversation with Kritika so challenging, is you're trying to say, well, so we need to accept those risks. And I think Kritika was pretty firm in saying, well, she thinks the way forward is that, yes, we have to accept those risks. And that's really an uncomfortable thing to accept, because we've been fighting so long to say no one should be put at risk from, like, no one should face violence while, you know, tending to their crops, because in the human to human case, that's massively unevenly distributed, right? Because in the West, people are not being mauled by tigers while they're making their food, right? So yeah, and this speaks to what you were saying earlier as well about levels here, Virginia, because whose risk are we taking seriously and not?
Yeah, and I'm not sure Kritika was saying we have to accept them entirely, but have to at least admit more risk. But yeah, it's definitely something that we haven't tolerated at all in the past. All the risks, or not all, but the vast majority of the risks have been for the animals to bear, and we've reaped the benefits.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging to think about on that scale, like a species level, how to make, or even within our own species, yeah, how to make people become more open and vulnerable to either risks or other possibilities, right? And I feel like that's perhaps where procedures or practices like just transition or transformative justice become so important, because then those kinds of frameworks might allow us to start thinking about what does reparation look like, and not just within our own species in addressing these kinds of issues around development, global development, that are always entangled with violent histories of imperialism and colonialism, but also thinking about, multi-species relations. What does that look like? What does reparation mean for other species whose homes and habitats have been destroyed? And I think some of the concepts that came up this season around Steve Cook's habitat rights, for example, for animals, are just kind of these creative ways to start getting at some of these types of problems. Because ultimately, it's really hard to imagine privileged groups just willingly, I suppose, kind of give up their power that they enjoy, whether we're talking about within human species, just global north nations that are reaping all the benefits of exploitation and extraction all around the world, but also humans as a species in relation to other animals. Yeah, it's really, really tough.
Yeah, and I think it's also a matter of saying who is asking for people to accept the risks, right? Because I think it's very easy when you're not the one facing that risk to say, well, we just need to be X, Y, and Z. But I think Kritika is really compelling us to think in a radical way. And she's turning towards the difficulty, which I think a lot of us try to avoid. We maybe look for like these simple narratives, this or that, this way or that way. And this makes me think a little bit about the conversation with Gary, because I think this was a key theme as well throughout, the kind of tension between animal welfare and animal rights. And yeah, I mean, I was pretty honest that for a long time I've kind of struggled with understanding what this tension is. Don't we just need a joint initiative and way forward, and every bit helps? But I think having that conversation with Gary, where he spoke about how some discourses and ideas can actually undercut and undermine this radical vision of the future, right? And I found that really compelling.
That was definitely a key tension for me, that tension between rights and welfare, and then going even further, the tension between rights and abolition, which Gary Francione was talking about, as opposed to, say, Will Kimlicker's idea of rights. And yeah, I think like you, Claudia, I was thinking, well, can't we have both? And won't that, which, I'm being consciously naive here, but you'd sort of think, well, we'll have rights and welfare, and then we'll have best of both worlds. But it does not work that way. If you're just trying to improve a situation, then you're accepting that situation rather than going, no, we need an entirely new way of being here.
What do you think about that, Darren, as someone who's worked in activist circles, right?
Yeah, it's always been a huge challenge in trying to craft campaigns where goals are actually realistic to achieve, while also ensuring that the broader, more radical messaging is not lost in that process, and that we are able to kind of present a bigger picture, a more transformative type of change beyond, just having a particular policy change or getting a specific company to stop a certain practice or drop a particular product, right? And how do we ultimately bring about, I believe paradigm shift was the term that came up in that episode. Yeah, it's just very, very challenging. But I think it is promising looking at some of the campaigns that have been happening, which some of this was mentioned in the interview with Corey about animal rising in the UK, for example. So I think the example that Corey brought up was more about focusing more on institutional change. So trying to get universities to commit to serving 100% plant-based foods in their cafeterias and things. But some of the other things that Animal Rising have done, from what I've seen on social media, which I'm not on there as often these days, trying to focus on finishing my PhD.
That all-consuming process.
Yeah, yeah. But I think they have shifted away from just focusing on an individual lifestyle change in terms of trying to convert individuals to adopt veganism or plant-based diet, and instead are now focusing much more on targeting corporations and trying to disrupt their supply chains, whether it's McDonald's or whatever, and really putting pressure on them to, understand the severity of this and the urgency of this kind of ongoing crisis that we're in relation to animal agriculture's contribution to climate catastrophes, right? So I feel like those are some really promising examples. And then the question always becomes, how do we get more people involved and on board and engaged in this kind of process? And it's difficult because another thing that came up in that interview was this topic of infighting. And so I thought Corey made an excellent argument for why we should not disparage infighting and instead see it as a necessary and constructive part of any social justice movement, as have been seen kind of historically in other movements as well. But I guess for me, the question is more how do we have more constructive, critical discussions with each other where people don't just rip each other apart, where relationships completely break down. And I think part of what's missing, this came up in the conversation I had with Dinesh, where he thinks that one of the issues is we don't seem to have kind of space, dedicated kind of environment that can foster these kinds of difficult conversations in our movement, right? And so I think that is something that's worth developing further, is which individuals and organizations might be able to hold that kind of space for activists to engage in critical reflection, and disagree.
Yeah, I find that really powerful because these conversations are thorny and difficult, and we're going to get things wrong, right? And I think we need to have space to misstep and say things wrong without, like you say, being ripped apart, because I think that can be stifling to having a conversation and to maybe airing concerns that you haven't thought through fully, right? To have a space where you can actually think through with one another is really important. And yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation with Corey. And I think, coming back to this tension between animal welfare, animal rights, and abolition is I think I agree that there is somewhat an irreconcilable tension between animal welfare and animal rights. But I'm not convinced that it's irreconcilable between animal rights and abolition. And in fact, I would probably, I think I do think that if you go too firm, too fast, I think that that's maybe counter to creating this type of space that we're talking about here, where you can create some space for imagination, for alternatives. That would be my kind of view on that if it's all or nothing, then I think that can be really stifling to fostering this kind of imagination of alternatives. It can be nothing with regards to how we hurt animals, but there needs to be alternatives to what that future might look like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you need that for people to have almost like something to believe in or something to fight for. And that's where I guess I personally am kind of more in disagreement with Gary's view about abolition in the sense of having all domesticated animals go extinct. And I understand where that's coming from on this very kind of embodied level of having that kind of skepticism and distrust that humans wouldn't do horrible things to other animals as long as they exist, right? But at the same time, I think that level of pessimism ultimately does not help us, I guess, in pursuing justice in these alternative ways. And I think it just doesn't really give people much to fight for. And we see how much people actually treasure and value our relationships with other animals. And it can be really caring relationships, really mutually beneficial, mutually respectful. We've seen that in the animal advocacy movement and animal sanctuaries where rescued animals, animals who have been deeply traumatized but now has a chance to live out the rest of their lives are engaging in all kinds of like really interesting activities and having all kinds of intimate and like dynamic kind of relationships with human caretakers or visitors at sanctuaries or volunteers. And I think those kinds of examples just show that, it doesn't have to be about extinction for all domesticated animals, right? Like it is actually possible. There are examples every single day in these rare spaces that, where these kinds of experimental kind of living and where humans are actively trying to be, I guess, actively challenging being more than animal and really trying to respect the autonomy and the agency and sovereignty of other species.
The way I took that idea of the extinction of domestic animals wasn't so much that humans would continue to mistreat animals for as long as they were domesticated. It was more that domestication in itself was a form of mistreatment and abuse. But the other thing is, this is all making all this talk of advocacy and activism is really making me think back to the episode on animal photojournalism, Joanne MacArthur's photographs, and how good they were at breaking down what we've just, or not what we've just been talking about, what we were talking about earlier, with that idea of, are we talking at individual level or sort of system level? And she said that what you were doing in animal photojournalism was really trying to do both, like show the individual and show the wider system that it's part of. And I thought her photographs are incredible, but they're just so good at capturing that. And then they don't imagine a different way, but they really expose the current way. I suppose that's their power, is they really expose where we are now. And that forces us to confront it and make us think that, or make us accept or admit or realize that a different way is necessary, rather than just being able to not exactly pretend it's not there, but ignore the things that we know are happening but aren't necessarily confronted with or brought to our notice every day.
Yeah, I think, I mean, visibility is obviously what comes to mind for me. Is she straight up makes worlds that are invisible to many of us visible, but not just in this kind of detached way. There's an intimacy to those photos that makes, like Darren was talking about earlier with regards to how we're speaking about sentientism. And, there's a lot of kind of interesting biological information that's coming forward about animals and the ways in which they structure their lives, wild animals. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff that comes forward with regards to how animals are structuring their lives. But I think what she does, in a way, who you are confounds explanation, right? Like, you can't explain who someone is. You see someone. And I think that those images make the someone apparent, right? It's not about them being a rat or about them being a kangaroo. It's about them being them in that situation. And that kind of contextually specific highlighting of their plight, of their situation, I think is super important to propelling us to creating these imaginaries, these alternatives, because there's got to be an alternative, right? And I think that those images go a long way in terms of consciousness raising, and they're coupled with what Darren was saying about activism. And I think some of the stuff that came up with Corey with regards to how activists compel us to think differently, right? Like, you need people that are pushing you to think differently, but you can't stop at disruption. You have to continue to build. And I think that that's something that's come up in the season, is you have to disrupt what's happening, but at the same time, you have to actively build an alternative future, because that's not just going to manifest in and of itself, right? Because we've been engaged in these problematic relations forever, right? Domestication is it's I mean, not forever, it's 15,000 years old, but for us, that's a pretty damn long time. So what does it mean to live in a world where domestication is no longer a dominant structure, right? That's really what would that world look like? And I think for Gary, he would say, well, there is no such thing as domesticated animals. And I think, I've been thinking about this. I think that we maybe have slightly different views on what domestication is. Like, I feel as though dogs will always be a domesticated species, no matter how feral they become, because that's part of their history. That's part of their, but maybe this is a tension between what it means to, like, at what point does a previously domesticated animal become a wild? Like, I think this is a failure of language.
Yeah, can I jump in there? Because I find that really interesting, because there's someone who's written about this. I think their name's Hall, or I could be mixing that with someone else. But, if a wild animal can become a domestic animal, then why can't a domestic animal become a wild animal? Why does it become feral, as you've just said, Claudia, and why is there always that history of domestication? Why isn't for a domestic animal there always that history of wildness? Which, there is, but we're happy to admit that or acknowledge that there's been a transition from wildness to domesticness. But then for some reason, we have more difficulty going the other way and saying that a domestic animal can become truly wild, whatever truly means. It becomes feral.
That's really interesting. And I think maybe we just haven't found the kind of vocabulary yet to have these nuanced conversations about how legacies follow animals, right? Like, our categorizations are imperfect, but I think domestication, no matter what form, I mean, I don't think that we will ever exist in a world in which dogs don't exist in some form or shape. Like, I think even if we've tried for a long time to eradicate numerous types of species that we don't want around, whether they be rats or dogs in specific, and we've failed. Like, I think eradication campaigns show us, even if not helping them breed, and I think breeding should be expelled. I think breeding as a practice is what needs to be stopped, not an active eradication of anything. But even if we were to try and actively eradicate, which I don't condone, we would fail because history has shown us that we would fail. We do. Somehow when we actively want to kill a species, we fail miserably. But when we actively want to like hunt them because we want their fur or skin or something, we succeed and we drive them to extinction. I don't know. Like we tend to always achieve. I'm being facetious, but I think there's an element of truth there. But I think dogs will always exist. And I think domestication, same ways in which sheep will. I think domestication will be part of their legacy. I mean, not legacy, part of their heritage. You can't, the same way I'm from South Africa and I'm a white South African, I can't disavow the fact that I come from, a heritage of colonization and of apartheid in South Africa, right? Like that's part of my heritage. Doesn't mean that it fully defines me and who I am now, but it certainly shaped my access to resources and benefits and risks, etc. Right? And I think that we haven't maybe yet, coming back to your tension between domestic and wild animals, maybe we just haven't yet found a way to show that amount of complexity and nuance when speaking about animals.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating conversation. I guess I kind of come at this from a slightly different angle. So there's a scholar in settler colonial studies, Patrick Wolf, who's often cited for saying that colonization is a structure, not an event. And I thought that is just such a helpful way of thinking about various forms of domination as structures, as institutions that have been established, and not as a single event or maybe multiple events that have happened throughout time. And I think of domestications in kind of a similar way, where if we start to understand domestication as a structure, both in terms of our laws and policies, but also the very built environment around us, and that spatial and also kind of social political dimension, domestication create the condition of domestication where animals who exist within that kind of social organization are inevitably domesticated, then we can start thinking about, what does rewilding mean? What does being feral mean in that context? It's always more about resisting and pushing back against this kind of intense kind of forms of social control through whether it's legal means or political, maybe even just various forms of institutions. And so I definitely feel like understanding domestication in that way makes it more possible, I suppose, to to then think about how, yes, like maybe dogs will always exist, but maybe they don't always have to exist in the kind of, and they maybe, sorry, to to use Claudia's terms, maybe they don't always have to carry that legacy with them forever, carry the kind of relationship with humans where they are always going to be, to a large extent, kind of dependent on us. And so ultimately it could become more equal, more interdependent, and where the structures of our society actually grant dogs or any other domesticated animals much more agency and in shaping the societies that we share.
Really nicely said. Virginia, we've been focusing quite a bit here on domestic animals. What do you think about this conversation in relation to like wild animals and your kind of work with conservation? Because, it's interesting, I think, how domestication and conservation tend to capture these different parts of our imagination, right?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that we're having such a strong influence even on wild animals now that, I mean, there are some scholars who are saying there's actually no such thing as a wild animal anymore because, that's taking it to extremes. But if a domestic animal is one that's influenced by humans, and that's not a good definition, but just for the sake of argument, then we are influencing all the animals on this planet now. So I think there is an argument that there's a sort of form of domestication of sort of every animal, and we're influencing wild animals and their behavior and their habitats so strongly that we have a real, well, you could argue that we have a responsibility to them in the same way that we do to domestic animals. which I can't remember which episode it was in, but someone was talking about how, certain rights, perhaps Will Kimlicka was saying, we have certain responsibilities to domestic animals that we don't necessarily owe to wild animals. But the more we influence their lives, then the more we do have responsibility for wild lives as well as domestic lives, especially when we start to blur the boundaries with projects like reintroduction projects or rewilding projects.
I think that's exactly right. And I think this is where Angie's idea of cosmopolitanism, like really expanding, we have to realize that our policies and our actions impact far beyond. I listened to a PhD defense yesterday, and someone used the word invisible stakeholders. And I think that that's really powerful, because I think they were speaking about future generations as invisible stakeholders that are often necessarily taken into account, but also the numerous animals, populations, environments, etc., that are not necessarily thought about when we create a policy with only human needs and interests in mind. So, guys, this has been a really fascinating conversation so far. I just want to do a little bit of a recap to make sure that I've covered everything that we've gone through. So in terms of like key themes that we've unpacked so far, I think decision-making is definitely one of them, and also the multi-scalar way in which decision-making operates and the complexities and tensions between these different scales. Imagination, in particular, I like the way Darren phrased it there, the crisis of imagination, that there is a bit of a crisis of imagination. But in the season, we're seeing more and more kind of scholars put forward ideas that foster either a space for imagination, whether that's through disagreement, or they're actually putting forward concepts and ideas that can create an alternative world, right? So whether this is through conceptual development like that of Steve Cook or Angie Pepper or Will Kimlicka, or actually thinking about different structures like what Corey and I think Dinesh do, that we need to kind of foster a new imaginary, a new vision of the world. So I think that's definitely a big one. The third kind of key theme was this benefits and burdens, the distribution as it currently exists, kind of who of our policy and our politics, who is benefiting and burdening. And I think that this is uneven across human to human, but also animals and humans. And then we've covered a lot. We spoke about the tensions between welfare rights and abolition, and this led us off into an interesting conversation about domestication and where the domestication and future of that exists. And then finally, I think we've also spoken about activism and the kind of significance of activism and consciousness raising in politics, but also the need to accept that we don't always have to agree on the way forward. However, that doesn't mean everything goes. Some things might actually undercut our political imperatives. Does that kind of are there any key themes that have come up in the season that you think we haven't yet touched on?
I felt that, yeah, that was very comprehensive. Yeah, pretty much got everything. I guess there was one thing in relation to photojournalism that I thought was very important to highlight, which relates to questions around strategies and imagination and all those things, and which is storytelling, which is, I think that's really part of what Joanne was talking about. It's not just simply showing the photos of other animals in different kind of contexts and situations, but also empowering them and really bring forth their subjectivity by sharing their stories. But also, I believe, yeah, Joanne's also taken plenty of photos of animals in sanctuaries as well. And I think that kind of helps people to envision more concretely these kind of alternative trajectories that we could go in, and different stories that isn't just about animals being victimized and suffering and in horrible conditions, right? So how we tell stories about animals is a whole separate question in terms of how we do that justice and how we do it ethically. But I just felt like, yeah, storytelling in general across species is a very important thing to highlight as well.
That's a really good point, because that's how you address things like crisis of imagination, isn't it? Through creating new narratives that might be aspirational, but and also that's how you really create changes of entire mindset through narrative rather than through necessarily facts and figures. We can be told how many how many animals die in or are killed in fur farms every year. But that doesn't have nearly the same impact as the kind of story that Joanne's able to tell through her pictures.
Yeah, it creates conceptual space. I think earlier on, I think earlier on we were talking about, needing to create space for disagreement amongst advocates and academics and politicians. But I think what storytelling does is it actively creates conceptual space. I think even if we appreciate that we can never do it perfectly, that's fine. But I think stories and art and photographs and philosophy create conceptual space to build from, right? Because if we're dealing with a world that's never existed, we need conceptual space. And I think Steve Cook touched on this. He was that idea of moral imagination, that we really need to craft. And I think stories are important, but they also come with power. And I think that we need to be cautious about, because stories can be created by anyone, anywhere, and take. And I absolutely love stories. I think another key thing that came up throughout, and I won't dwell on this too much because I think it touches on what we've spoken about with regards to domestication, was pets. I was quite surprised by how much pets came up in the season with focusing on politics. Just the people were pretty unequivocally against, in many ways, the current status of pet relations and just the absolute hierarchy that's involved in pet relations. And this wasn't something I was expecting at the start of the season, and it really just came up a lot. So we've covered commonalities and key themes, and I think we've gone into some tensions. Are there any tensions that we haven't touched on that you think we should delve into before we get to your quotes?
I'm not too sure. I feel like we covered quite a bit, whether it's between abolition and welfare or positive and negative rights. Yeah, I think we covered quite a bit of ground in terms of the major tensions.
Okay, good. We've done a good job then. All right, well then let's switch. Let's get to your quotes now, and we can talk a little bit about your quotes before we start wrapping things up. So Virginia, why don't you kick us off? Give us your quote and tell us a little bit about it.
Great, thanks. This actually is really a lot about agency. And it's a quote from Henry Beston in his book, The Outermost House, a year of life on the great beach of Cape Cod. But I found it quoted in another book called Of Wolves and Men by Barry Lopez. So I'll read it now. We need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate for having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein do we err, for the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with the extension of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendour and travail of the earth.
That's a wonderful quote. I think Catherine Gillespie mentioned him previously as well. The quote does actually bring up for me a tension or a gap in the season. And I think the season was very much focused on Western politics and kind of contemporary politics, because even the opening line of that quote makes me think there are many, and I mean, it's not just Western versus Indigenous, but it's also on a temporal scale and a geographical scale, is not everyone has kind of thought about animals in this detached way. For many groups, animals have political agency and political power within their communities. But the season did very much focus on kind of Western political structures. But this kind of idea that Barry Lopez, it's not Barry, sorry, I'm attributing it to the wrong person.
Henry Beston,
this idea that he's bringing forward, I think in the beginning of the quote in particular, makes me think that there are many other groups that attribute this kind of agency and power to animals. But it's a beautiful quote.
I like it because it really is talking about how we have to recognise the agency of animals, which we don't, and we have to recognise them for themselves, not as just less than human.
Exactly.
to, play around with more, more prefixes and suffixes. But I also like the idea that he mentions their nations, and that was something that came up, well, in the series, but also in this discussion. Perhaps we need to recognize animals as a nation state themselves and afford them rights and consideration on that level.
Yeah, I think this kind of the idea, sovereignty could have been an episode in of itself, but I think it did come up. I think Will, Steve, and Dinesh all spoke in different ways about how we respect we have to foster this, and we have to foster this kind of respect in our policies, right? That they should have distinctive range and decision-making over their territories and their lands. And yeah, I really like the idea of viewing them as their own nations with their own ideas, and generally multi-species nations, I think. Darren, any thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely feel like that wonderful quote really kind of pushes us to think about animals in a radically different way that ultimately comes back to, how do we create more just relations on that scale between species, and certainly respecting them and negotiating with them perhaps as a kind of nation-to-nation relationship. I think that is, again, in practice, probably extremely difficult, but I think as a kind of creative step towards reimagining futures, it's a very powerful quote.
I mean, again, it might just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right? Like creating interhuman global politics was difficult, but we tried because it's worthwhile. Darren, why don't you tell us your quote?
Sure. So mine ended up being a little bit long. I initially wanted to take a quote from one of the episodes this season. And Claudia, you said that's not usually
but it would have been great. You're welcome to do that.
But that's okay. So I've been reading my supervisor, Dinesh Wadhwal's new book, Animals in Capital. So it's a bit of a long quote. Hopefully it won't take too long, so just bear with me. This is from pages 12 to 13 in a section entitled Labor. Dinesh says, to an extent, because prevailing knowledge systems make animals appear as raw materials and consumption commodities, this produces an epistemic effect which hides their active role as laborers. We perceive that production processes act upon animals in order to produce value, rather than the reverse, that animals act within their production processes in order for value to be produced. At base, this attitude, which assumes their passivity, might be traced to a particular form of anthropocentrism, which haunts how many of us, including animal advocates, look at animals and perceive them and their power. It is precisely this hierarchical anthropocentrism that haunts conceptions of animals in production, which results in framing these beings purely as raw materials rather than as agents within production, which animate productive processes through their creative labor. Certainly, managers of agribusiness imagine that animals are merely resources that are worked on in order to become products. But it is disarming to recognize that many animal advocates implicitly imagine animals in this way too, as simply beings who are forced to become raw materials in order to produce food, rather than active subjects who have created, through their labor, forced or otherwise, the world that we see. And it kind of goes on for much longer, but I just thought that was a very interesting way to start getting people to completely shifting our perspectives on how we understand not just animal agency, but to start questioning what kind of powers other species of animals have or don't have, and how that might shape and inform our advocacy, whether it's on their behalf or with them. And so I just thought that's a very fascinating intervention in conversations about the relationship between non-human animals who are held captive and exploited within human political and economic systems, namely capitalism, global capitalism. And so I thought that was a pretty powerful quote.
What I really like about that, though, is it also compels us to think about the productive power of the concepts we use. So this speaks a little bit to what you were talking about earlier with regards to feral, wild, and domestic, but it's also how I think animals are constituted in politics, right, as resources, as commodities, as property, it opens and forecloses particular opportunities for them to act. So if that's the way they sit in our imagination as property, commodities, even if that's as advocates or as politicians, then we don't think beyond that. If they're not positioned as agents or as subjects, then we're not thinking about what they need as agents or as subjects. We're thinking about what they need as victims or as commodities or as property. And I think this again comes to this kind of idea of imagination, but the way in which it's institutionalized in practice and in policy. So I think, like, instead of seeing them as laborers, we're seeing, and I mean, there are problems with, I think, thinking about animals as laborers. Sometimes there's a problem with some people thinking about them as active participants in their own destruction, which is, I think we need to be mindful of that line of reasoning. But there's something to be said for not objectifying them as these categories, but viewing them as active agents, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Virginia?
Yeah, I hear it as like it helps overcome that idea of commodification of animals and recognizes their forced labor. So not that they're active, or they are active participants, but not that they're willing participants. This is forced labor and enslavement. But it recognizes their qualities, I suppose, and their abilities, and therefore helps us to recognize them again as agents and subjects rather than objects. Perhaps I can put it that way.
Definitely. And I think it also prompts us to think more carefully about what animals might do otherwise if they were not forced to perform certain types of labor. How might they spend their time? How might they actually use their creative powers to shape the world around them? And so it brings up all sorts of interesting questions there in imagining in a more positive direction. Yeah, like what animals might choose to do otherwise, given how would they spend their energy, and how would they engage and interact with the rest of the world outside of that intensely exploitative environment.
Yeah, and commodification is massively complicated and difficult to talk about. I remember, like, it's huge, and it makes me think that future season focused on commodification or on economics is probably needed, because kind of that running parallel to this conversation about politics throughout the whole season has also been a question of economic value, right? Even in the conversation about SDGs, economics always seems to take supremacy. And I think that this speaks to a much broader kind of movement of thinking about what our goals and objectives are in relation to capital and capitalism, right? But that's a huge and different and big avenue to learn more about. So thank you guys so much for your time. It's been a really brilliant conversation. Do you want to perhaps just give us a little sense of what you're currently working on now? And if people are interested in some of the work you're doing, how they can get in touch with you?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll just quickly say that I'm currently in the third and final year of my PhD. My research focusing on farmed animal sanctuaries as sites where potential coalitions or solidarity could be generated between animal advocacy movements and the animals themselves with other broader social and environmental justice movements. And so this past year, I've done a little bit of field work at a sanctuary that really tries to embody and put into practice values of anti-oppression, of respecting the autonomy and agency of other animal residents at the sanctuary. And so, yeah, I'm kind of currently working through data analysis and trying to make sense of my kind of ethnographic experience spending a month being a volunteer at the sanctuary. Yeah, so that's what I'm currently working on in terms of where folks can find my work. I'm not really, I guess academia.edu is where I have uploaded a few things here and there. But otherwise, I'm not super active in posting and sharing my writings and stuff like that online, but maybe more so in the future. Yeah, that's it for now.
And I'm still with the University of Exeter until the end of the year. I'm finishing up on this Wellcome Trust project, which is fantastic. So people can still get me, they'll still find me on my University of Exeter profile and my University of Exeter email. But yeah, the big move to Aotearoa, New Zealand has been because I'm starting a new role, which I won't say too much about yet because I haven't started yet. I start in 3 days' time. But it's research impact for a Crown Research Institute over here. So it's a bit of a shift from academia, but still research. But yeah, we'll watch this space.
Really important. I know we had a big conversation about that. And I know this is going to be airing in early 2024. So when Virginia says the end of the year, she's meaning she's still at the Exeter until the end of 2023. Okay, folks. Well, it was really wonderful to talk with you. It's been a big season with massive concepts and ideas. And I think we did a good job in this episode. So thank you so much, and wishing you both a wonderful festive season. And yeah, have a rest.
Thank you both. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Virginia, we've made it. It's the final animal highlight. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done over the course of this season. I've learned so much from you. And I'm really delighted about who you're going to be talking about today. I really think this is a fascinating case.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. Really, thank you. But also thanks for this one, because this one, with the other highlights, I tried quite hard to make them fit with the program interviews, or podcast interviews. But this one, I could just kind of I had free reign to pick what I wanted to. So today I really want to talk about het cattle because their story is so fascinating.
Yeah, I remember reading about this while preparing for my PhD. Obviously, everything was cows. I still tend to use cows instead of cattle, but that's my own quirk. I know I confuse people with it.
Well, I think that's the English language. We do default to cows when we mean cattle.
Yeah, I mean, I do it because the word cattle, etymologically, it actually previously didn't only include cows. It used to historically be cows, sheep, people. It was because cattle meant property. So it's kind of got etymological links to property and to capital and to all of the things that I want to disrupt these animals being equated with. So cow.
Does it link to chattel?
Yeah, exactly.
As well? Yeah, okay.
So only over time have various people and animals been removed from the category of cattle. And it's like a form of movable property, like chattel. So yeah, and I know that I always, whenever I write papers or anything, people are like, why are you using cow instead of cattle? Cattle is the collective noun for cows. And I'm like, no. But anyway, I'm not trying to, I'm just saying, and also following people like Catherine Gillespie and others that kind of say it's an important move to do that, to kind of use cow. But that's a different discussion for another day, because this is already a jam-packed full highlight and a fascinating, really, really fascinating case study. So I'm gonna let you take it away.
Sure. Well, but just to say as well, they came up when I was doing my PhD as well, and that's why I've chosen them, really, because they come up in rewilding. Yeah,
exactly. And yeah, it's, listeners, you're in for a treat. Okay, I'll stop. Go ahead.
So het cattle are interesting politically for two reasons. The first relates to their origins and the Heck brothers. The second relates to biopolitics and the governance of het cattle as liminal animals caught between wildness and domesticity. Het cattle are named after the Heck brothers, who first bred them, created them really, in the 1920s and 30s. Heinz and Lutz Heck were German zoologists who managed the Munich and Berlin zoos, respectively. They bred the animals we now know as het cattle in a deliberate attempt to recreate extinct wild bovines, the aurochs, from whom domestic cattle are descended. Aurochs were huge, roughly the same size as bison. Bulls could be almost 2 meters tall at the shoulder, and cows weren't much smaller. Aurochs were sexually dimorphic, with the males and females looking very different. The bulls were black, while the cows were red. Both cows and bulls had large, distinctively shaped horns, similar to the horns of today's Spanish fighting bulls. Like Spanish fighting bulls, aurochs would have been fierce, aggressive animals, very different from most of the domestic cattle we're familiar with today. And in attempting to recreate the aurochs, the Heck brothers were deliberately trying to de-domesticate cattle through a process of breeding back. They wanted to produce a pure wild bovine, not tainted or degenerated by domestication, something which was considered a mutation of wild genes. Part of their motivation was linked to their association with the German National Socialist Party. The Nazi ideology of eugenics extended to animals as well as people, and they were interested in producing a master race of cattle for the Third Reich. To an extent, the Heck brothers succeeded. Heck cattle are large, although nowhere near as large as aurochs were, and not even as large as some modern domestic cattle breeds. Heck cows and bulls both have horns, although their horns are not as large or as distinctively shaped as the aurochs were. And Heck cattle aren't sexually dimorphic the way the aurochs were. Both cows and bulls can be almost any colour, from black to red. Like aurochs, though, Heck cattle are fierce and notoriously aggressive to humans. But despite the relative success of the Heck brothers in creating Heck cattle, their cattle are controversial today, not least because of their association with the Nazis, but also because of their liminal status as neither wild nor domestic. So let's back up a little bit and acknowledge the process by which animals go from being wild to being domestic. Human intervention in animal reproduction produced the domestic species we recognise today, including domestic cattle, and it's specifically human influence on animal breeding, what we call artificial selection as opposed to natural selection, which is seen as a key element of domestication. So even with breeding back, which is supposed to be a method of de-domestication to recreate an extinct wild species, the fact that humans are intervening in animals' breeding means that some people still consider it a domestication process. In their view, it's essentially impossible for humans to produce a wild animal, because if an animal is the product of human intervention, then by default it's a domestic species. So a major criticism of the Heck is that they're not actually a wild species. They're merely a simulacrum of the aurochs, which leaves them in an interesting position with respect to their relationship with people. It can be argued that they're not really wild, but they're not meant to be considered domestic either, so it's unclear what our relationship with them might be. Despite concerns over their provenance and their authenticity, Heck cattle have been embraced by rewilding advocates because of their potential to help regenerate wilder landscapes. Large herbivores are seen as crucial in landscape creation, so are a key element of rewilding projects, particularly in Europe. Part of the reason rewilders are so interested in Heck cattle for this role is that they can live independently from humans. They were bred to be extremely hardy, to be able to survive in harsh conditions and to be capable of subsisting on diets that are very low in nutrition without supplementary feeding or any other management by people. Rewilders hope that Heck cattle can play the role of the aurochs in the landscape, grazing in a naturalistic way, disturbing vegetation and breaking up ground, all of which creates opportunities for other species and so contributes to increasing biodiversity. Jamie Lorimer and Clemens Driessen have written about this in relation to Heck cattle involved in the Uitvaardersplassen rewilding project in the Netherlands. But rewilding, like Heck cattle themselves, is controversial. While it's heralded as the holy grail of ecological restoration by its proponents, others have concerns over rewilding, particularly over how much or how little human intervention is involved. And Heck cattle have become caught up in these wider debates. In their paper on Heck cattle in the Uitvaardersplassen, Lorimer and Driessen talk about how Heck cattle and people become entangled in the landscape of the rewilding project. The extent to which people should or shouldn't intervene in the lives of the animals involved in rewilding projects is particularly interesting with respect to Heck cattle because they're liminal animals, neither wild nor domestic. This has significant implications for how they're conceptualized and therefore how they're treated. Even though Heck cattle are hardy and, theoretically at least, capable of living independently from humans, scholars question whether this is really the case, and, even if they are, whether we should allow them to. Do we have a responsibility towards them as a domestic species, or should we allow them their own agency as wild animals? The difficulty is that they're both wild and domestic, and neither wild nor domestic. And in response to the status of liminal animals like Heck cattle involved in rewilding projects like the Uitvaardersplassen, Lorimer and Driessen have identified new systems of biopolitics, the governance of life and death, which relate to our relationships with these animals. And these biopolitics are different from those relating to purely wild or domestic animals. They attempt to accommodate the new human-animal relations which emerge as a result of rewilding. And these biopolitics will need to continue to evolve if we're to establish multi-species flourishing in the Anthropocene.
Really interesting. Yeah, I guess I don't know if I'm as attached to kind of the divide between domestic and wild anyway. I mean,
that's a really interesting question. You know, are they binary? Is it wild or domestic, or is it a spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite context specific. Like, I think you can have probably, I said that Chattanam, you know, because then you've got concepts like feral coming up as well, right? Where they're domestic animals, but in effect they've gone wild. Like, what does that mean? Where does wild begin and domestic end? And
that's the thing. Why are they feral? Why aren't they wild again?
Yeah, so like there's a lot of border policing, and I understand the kind of impetus. I'm not saying do away with the concepts. They're all useful concepts to use, but when you're kind of policing this neat boundary between they are wild and they are domestic, and you know this is how we treat domestic animals, this is how we treat wild animals. Yeah, I mean, like you say, these kinds of biopolitical relationships are evolving, and yeah, I've definitely got some ambivalent feelings myself towards rewilding, particularly in terms of how it oftentimes also entails kind of moving animals from one community to another community. There's a lot of thorny, tricky questions involved in rewilding.
Yeah. And I think the reason people get so excited isn't the right word, but you know, so adamant about whether something is wild or whether it is domestic is because of those ways we treat animals and how much or how little we intervene, and you know whether we owe them responsibilities because they're domestic or whether we should allow them their own sovereignty.
As an aside, just when you were speaking about their kind of the entanglement of the hick cows with the Nazi Party, the Nationalist Party, it's really interesting. One of the kind of things that came up through my research was just how much cows are entangled with nationalism generally. So it's quite, and I'm talking about everything from Americans taking dairy cows with them to the Antarctica as a means of trying to say that we've laid claim to the space, to Christopher Columbus having cows on his second voyage to South America, to say like cows have really been kind of caught up in national projects forever in ways many other domesticated animals aren't. So it's not surprising to me that they've kind of become this poster child for backbreeding as well. So yeah, but I've obviously got a bit of a lens towards cows.
Well, but that's a good point, because the Heck brothers did backbreed other animals, but you don't hear about that nearly as much. There's the Heck horse, I think, but you don't hear about them.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, there's always this, I know Andrea Petit, she does a lot of work on this kind of, there's always seems to be horse, cows, and humans. They always seem to come up together at the same time. Like I know stud books, the first kind of quote unquote stud book was from a horse, but it was very loosely done. It wasn't really kind of recording the genes. And of course, these herd books are an essential tool of domestication, right? This follows the lineages of both male and female bovines or animals to kind of create a breed. But the very first kind of recorded herd book was for a cow. It was shorthorns. So it's one of the oldest kind of activities of making a breed, making a domesticated animal. Anyway, I could talk about this forever and ever. Really fascinating set of kind of tensions you've brought together there. So I really appreciate it. And thank you once again for all of your work on the animal highlights this season. You put in a lot of work and they were really fascinating. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for all your work with The Animal Turn. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor to work on it.
Thank you so much to Darren and Virginia for being fantastic guests. A special thank you to Virginia for doing the animal highlights over the course of the season. They were amazing. Thank you to Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music, and Rebecca Shen for her design work, particularly as it relates to our Instagram page. She's really been doing a lot of great work there. And I'm excited that Rebecca is joining the Animal Turn team more permanently. It's going to be an exciting year, 2024. A big thank you also to Christian Mentz, who joined us last year and has been doing a lot of the sound editing, almost all of the sound editing for the podcast. Thank you, Christian. It's been amazing to develop and grow this podcast with you. Thank you, as always, to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring this podcast. Their continued support helps keep this going, and it's just a delight to be affiliated with a research group that cares so deeply about animals and animal studies and scholarship. So thank you to all of them, and thank you also to you listeners for your continued support and listenership. I remain really grateful and humbled at your continued support of the podcast. So thank you so much for listening and supporting the show. I'm so delighted. But let me leave it there. I hope you all have had a great start to 2024 and that the rest of the year goes swimmingly. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hurtenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.